So welcome back for today's discussion. This is the fifth installment of this podcast series, Rethinking Contemporary Islamic Movements in and across Europe and the Middle East. So this podcast series is hosted by the Al-Walid Centre in the University of Edinburgh and the Centre of Islamic Studies in the University of Cambridge. We also thank the Gerda Henkel Foundation for its financial support. So my name is Dr. Eyre, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at the Al-Walid Centre in the University of Edinburgh.
And my name is Dr. Iman Dawood, and I am based at the Centre of Islamic Studies at the University of Cambridge.
So today we have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Arndt Emmerich. Arndt is a lecturer in sociology at the University of Hertfordshire and also a guest researcher at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity. So his research interest is in the governance of religious diversity, the sociology of religion, and interreligious encounters.
Arndt's findings and commentaries have been published in numerous academic journals, including Politics and Religion, Social Compass, and also in the BBC, Al Jazeera, Deutsche Welle, Times of India, and he's also been featured in the podcast Religion Inside. He's also the author of the book Islamic Movements in India, Moderation and Its Discontent, published in 2020. Welcome, Arndt. We're so excited to have you with us.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us, Arndt. So we'd love, first of all, to hear a bit about your experiences researching Salafism in Germany. I mean, what led you to study Salafism in the first place and in Germany in particular? And more generally, why do you think studying Salafism matters?
Yeah, hi. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And yeah, I'm really looking forward to our discussion. And I remember the Cambridge Symposia very well, where we already had like a lot of fruitful discussions. So I really value the opportunity that we can continue this here. And yeah, Guy, to come to your question in terms of Salafism in Germany, why I started to study it, and also why it could matter beyond like scholars focusing on Salafism. I mean, I started researching Salafism mainly in Europe, in the UK, and Germany around 2017, when I joined the project Changing Structures of Islamic Authority, which was run by Professor Masuda Bano at the University of Oxford. And so within this broader research project, I essentially just came out of my PhD then, which was on Islamic movements in India. So I was quite interested in actually looking at what is going on in Europe in terms of Islamic movements, the influence of trans-Islamic movements. And so the project in itself was quite convenient because it had like kind of a broader research question. And so we were looking at how transnational Islamic movements pass on their teaching and their practices to essentially European Muslims. And one of our case studies was Germany. And within this broader kind of like project conceptualization, we looked at the more like Saudi-inspired Salafism and how it manifests itself in Germany, for instance. And so that was essentially how I came to study Salafism in Germany. And interestingly, between like, let's say 2007 and 2023, it was really defined by a quite interesting growth rate, like in a way like that it had really like among all the kind of different Islamic traditions in Germany, it was quite appealing to youngsters. It had like around like 40% growth rate. It was really appealing to essentially German youth. And so I started to study it through more like an ethnographic approach, where I essentially had the opportunity to like hang out with young Salafi actors, went to their locations, to some mosques, participated in online spaces, went to kind of public dawah stalls, but also essentially just spent time during their free time. And through that, I could like really see how a Salafi identity within the kind of Western European context is negotiated, performed, modified, which was for me quite interesting. And maybe one last point to introduce the kind of theme of German Salafism. And I think that's also kind of broadly true for other kind of European countries. Salafism in Germany is essentially a minority movement within a minority of different kinds of Islamic traditions in Germany. So I was quite interested in how this kind of smaller kind of Islamic movement of Salafism in Germany interacts with other kinds of traditions, such as different kinds of Diyanat mosques in Germany, which are quite prominent, the different kinds of Bosnian traditions. And in the UK, we looked a bit more at, for instance, like Deobandi Islam, and how do young Salafi actors, which just kind of emerged on the scene, interacted with these more kind of established traditions. And so, yeah, that's something which I found quite interesting in studying it. And maybe just to kind of locate Salafism a little bit, it's often kind of perceived as the kind of most kind of conservative kind of Islamic practice within all the kind of Islamic traditions. Whether that's true or not is obviously up for empirical research, but there is this kind of perception of Salafism of promoting insular lifestyles, rigid kind of gender boundaries, and in a way also kind of assuming that Salafis prefer to be insular and actually not communicate with either like other Muslim or non-Muslim groups. And in that way, in terms of like locating it a little bit within the wider kind of political kind of discourse, it makes it an easy target in a way for like politicians and government authorities to single it out as, for instance, in Germany, there's always this kind of discourse of Salafis create parallel societies, Parallelgesellschaften. And in that way, you know, it's often construed as running against the values of whatever a liberal kind of democracy is. And in some ways, it's also kind of construed as like being kind of conducive to kind of non-violent or violent extremism and so on. And I think with my kind of research agenda, I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into how do Salafis navigate all these different tensions in a way. So, you know, that was like kind of a long introduction to kind of a short research question, I guess.
No, that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you. No, the thing is, because you've done such amazing ethnographic research, I can only imagine that your findings reflect a very different kind of perspective on Salafism than what is portrayed in public discourse. So maybe you could tell us a little bit more about really your main findings and how, they counter some of those, misconceptions.
Yeah, in some ways, Iman, I follow your work a little bit as well, like kind of breaking down this kind of static understanding of Salafism, like kind of seeing it as usually being, in Europe, in Germany, and it's often seen as well, it's entirely influenced by kind of foreign religious authorities, either from Saudi Arabia, from Egypt, and other kinds of countries in the Middle East. And so in order to understand these kinds of discourses, I had to spend a little bit more with these young Salafi activists or just adherents and look a little bit what's actually going on the ground in German cities, in German neighborhoods and so on. And by doing that, I could actually maybe to talk about 3-4 of my key findings. I could actually see that Salafi actors are not inclusively kind of motivated by dawah work and actually just exclusively focusing on religion and essentially protecting their kind of lifestyle, but actually also are more and more invested in processes of political accommodation, for instance. Like essentially, you're also understanding how can we protect like kind of a religious minority lifestyle within like German's legal and democratic framework, and what do we have to do with it? So in my writing about Salafism, I kind of looked at different phases. So I mean, German Salafism started quite late, maybe so it really kind of, even though there's some evidence that some kind of dawah work was already there from the like late 1960s. But essentially, Salafism, in the way we understand it today, really started in the kind of late 80s, early 90s, which was really then kind of the kind of emerging phase, where there were some pioneers who started to set up some small, Salafi-influenced institutions that then kind of merged with like a phase where German converts kind of also came and joined this kind of movement, which was kind of in the early 2000s. And from the mid 2000s, you can really see, okay, we're now in the kind of consolidation phase where Salafis are really trying to, you know, get this kind of Dawa movement with Dawa stalls, institution buildings, mainly religious institution building, kickstarted. And at some point, especially around 2010, the state responded to it with, for instance, prohibitions, proscriptions, generally kind of like more surveillance. And Salafis again responded to it in a quite vocal way with street protests and so on, which led in some ways to more kind of state responses and so on. But we are now in a phase where it's a bit different, where Salafis in Germany, you know, started coming up with, you know, legal advocacy groups, for instance, thinking about, okay, how can we actually emulate the structure of the kind of Catholic or evangelical church in Germany, and essentially starting to really engage with what is there in front of their threshold and in front of their door in terms of, okay, what are the, for instance, also the courts which we can approach if we want to, like, you know, have a religious minority demand? What can we actually learn from Jewish minority communities, for instance? So these are kind of interesting things, which breaks up a bit like this kind of static understanding of Salafism that is only kind of interested in inward-looking lifestyles and dawah and religious practice, which from my research is not enough. So my research definitely goes beyond that. And maybe kind of a third subpoint is like, in some of these Salafi spaces, you even like hear discussions about elections, participating in elections. And is it actually always kind of like a no-go for us to participate in elections? Or is it actually fine to potentially like vote for someone who actually would not harm the status quo of Islam in Germany, for instance? So that was an interesting discussion which came about in the latest Turkish elections, because there were a lot of also like, you know, second, third generation of Germans with a kind of Turkish migration biography, who are then kind of like, we're thinking about, what about like, can we vote Erdogan, but also can we vote a politician in Germany who might have like kind of a neutral stance to Islam in Germany? And these are discussions which are going on right now, which is kind of interesting. And maybe like a third point, there's also like kind of like an exciting discussion about like kind of more like intra-Muslim alliances. Like generally, like Salafis are always kind of described as saying, okay, they actually do rigid boundaries to other Islamic traditions, to like ethnic mosques around the corner and so on. But if you closely look, you see that that is kind of a bit more blurry than we might assume, and actually that there are relations to local neighborhood mosques, that they are sometimes even in sermons or seminars, like kind of active kind of like discourses which say, well, we shouldn't divide our hearts and minds. Like, you know, we should actually keep, even though there are theological differences, we should actually keep it together and not like constantly criticize each other. So these kinds of discourses are happening, which is in some ways also like kind of maybe potentially like a sign of maturity of the movement. By now you have leaders which are in their 40s and 50s, which is very different to 20, 30 years ago when all the leaders were still quite young and were really had to point to proof and so on, even though a lot of this boundary framing is still going on, but there's a bit more ambiguity within this kind of thing. And similar, maybe my last point to that before I come back to you, there is some kind of you know, nascent evidence about an emerging kind of motivation to participate a little bit more in interface dialogue, like, you know, like something like, well, let's actually look, what are the other kinds of religious minorities, conservative religious minorities, or something like ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities who actually face similar kinds of constraints as us, or who actually have similar kinds of like concerns, something like about the LGBTQI movement, which is not just our concern, but it's also been found in evangelical Christians or in ultra-Orthodox Jewish communities. So let's at least in our kind of sermons and so on, show that to our like kind of congregation and so on. And in a way, it shows a kind of learning curve where, because I mean, the main kind of objective of Salafi communities in Germany, in their very kind of heterodox kind of manifestations, is to pass on the dean, high Iman and religious learning to the next generation. And so there is this awareness that we can maybe not do this entirely on our own in a minority context, and actually need some kind of allies, need to learn from other kinds of communities. And that is quite interesting. And in that way, Salafi movements, similar to any other kind of religious or non-religious movement, responds to political opportunities and constraints in a way. Like right now with the current political climate, the political opportunities are shrinking a little bit for Salafi communities, similar to maybe what we saw in 2010 in Germany, but the responses are slightly different. We're not seeing kind of a grassroots, a street protest kind of mobilization, but we're actually seeing some much more kind of calm response to it, like getting legal advisory, like thinking about the next step, having a legal advocacy group, maybe even consulting with lawyers and so on. And that comes from the heart of the German Salafi movement right now, which is quite interesting for me to study and to understand.
Yeah, this is really, really interesting. Thank you so much. I wanted to quickly just follow up on a couple of things you said. Was I right in hearing you say that there was this kind of consolidation period within the sort of German Salafi scene in the 2000s, and then there was this sort of imposition of political constraints by the German authorities from the 2010s? Is that roughly what you're saying? That sounds like a really important kind of moment, right? As you mentioned, this kind of imposition of constraints in this period for slowly driving some of these shifts that you described in such richness. Could you explain to us just very briefly, I mean, what explains the imposition of those constraints by the German authorities from 2010? I mean, why did that happen, very roughly? And secondly, and relatedly, I'm just wondering, you've discussed again in lots of detail about all these new discussions within Germany's sort of Salafi community about the legitimacy or illegitimacy of, say, street protests, legal activism, perhaps even voting. And so I'm wondering how these negotiated ideas, discussions within Germany's Salafi community, how has that shaped the kind of the internal kind of organizational structure of the group? Are we seeing a kind of a fractures and fissuring within the German Salafi community, or is there actually a growing consensus and a kind of almost like sort of solidarity around these new ideas more generally? Yeah, just in case you had any thoughts on that.
Yeah, no, these are very good questions. And in a way, this is exactly what I try to understand in my research. For instance, let's go to this kind of political constraints, which were really visible from the early 2010s onwards. I mean, the Salafi research really started off in Germany and yeah, I mean, the UK and the Netherlands a bit earlier for sure, but it really started like in the European context with like these publications by De Koenig or like Becker, who really started in 2007, 2008 to publish the first kind of Salafi kind of related publications. And that was also this at the same time in the German context when I think the German intelligence service for the first time mentioned Salafism as a phenomenon in their kind of reports. And I mean, yeah, obviously, like we were also like in this time post 9/11, there were then the 2005, 2006, or like the Madrid and London kind of bombings essentially. And essentially, Salafism around that time was always kind of seen as kind of close to that kind of, we know the kind of convener belt thesis, even though it's highly rejected and highly problematic, but we're always seeing that Salafism as a movement. And I think government authorities, they started to embrace these kinds of convener belt thesis more and more. Germany has a very interesting and peculiar thing, because around 2009, 2010, there were attempts for the first time in the German context that Salafis try to build institutions, and not so much as what I described earlier, what is happening now, like macro institutions, like kind of legal advocacy groups, like becoming kind of something like, I mean like micro institutions, like having the first kind of Salafi kind of mosque, having the first kind of Salafi kind of Islamic school, which also offers online courses. And that happened in Germany is a federal state. It has like each of the 16 German states has a lot of autonomy in terms of, well, cultural policies, but also kind of, intelligence out. Like Germany essentially has 16 intelligence kinds of state, local state kind of units. And essentially, there was this debate around that time that there was like this project of an expansion of an Islamic school where the Salafi creed, the manhaj could kind of be taught, but it was in one state where there were not that many Muslims as in another state. And so essentially the Salafi community decided, why don't we locate it to a state where there are more Muslims? In a way, like a very logical kind of reasoning. And it was publicized, you know, they had like kind of very assertive kind of PR, social media campaigns, even spoke to journalists around the time. But the two different kinds of intelligence units got heard of it. And so there was then this moment that the state entered a competition with each other saying, no, we are not taking them, you keep them. And so essentially in that moment, it was not about the Salafi school itself. It was essentially about two local states in Germany trying to they were in competition. And what happened is that this project never really took off. But the difference around that time was that Salafis responded quite vocal against it. They hosted kind of almost like kind of street markets, invited politicians, and wanted, maybe in a little bit of a clumsy way, enter a dialogue. And that was not possible. I mean, you know, the project never kicked off. And then obviously at that time, then, you know, ISIS came about, you know, and similar kinds of dynamics. So essentially things got much worse, which then like also some mosques were closed down in Germany. Some people were even imprisoned because they were essentially at that point, even though the internal Salafi discourse was very diverse, and there were the mainline Salafi actors were always quite against ISIS and these kinds of things, and really warned against it. But as we know also from the British context and so on, some people went to Syria and so on, then we had returnees and so on. And essentially the political opportunities for Salafis really kind of shrunk. And the movement got more and more into a crisis in the German context, which for me was interesting to observe. How do you respond to that kind of a crisis? That Salafi mosques are not always full anymore. You cannot like open up spaces for teaching and so on. And that was then this kind of new phase, which I thought, okay, there's actually a big reflection phase within the Salafi communities about how to respond to this kind of political and institutional crisis. We are just not managing to institutionalize our Dawa work. The state is not happy with us. And so there were quite interesting reflection processes going on, which then led more to this kind of legal advocacy phase and so on, which we see now. And it's now again in crisis, which again links to what you said, Guy, in terms of like the kind of infights, you know. I mean, Salafism, whether it's in the UK or anywhere around the world, is always known for its feuds in internal disputes and its rigidity essentially. And that happened in Germany right from the beginning of the movement. There were fallouts, there were mergers, there were re-mergers, there were fallouts. And in a way, it makes this movement quite dynamic and in a way, it's quite innovative to really kind of also respond to the local context in that regard. But these infights still exist, and sometimes they're even up to today. I think they still kind of then can harm this kind of institutionalization process, which we are witnessing today. Because at some point around 2019, 2020, I thought, okay, really, they're really coming together and essentially now pushing that. But if you see the real kind of closed discourse in Germany right now and observe it a bit, you realize, okay, there are new infights happening right now at this point. And for us, you know, religious studies scholars, Islamic scholars, sociologists, this is important to observe and again now see what is this new wave of political constraints, infights, and so on doing to the movement in a way. Yeah.
I think I want to follow up with another question, because so much of what you're kind of describing, I've seen kind of happening as well in the UK scene. So one of my main questions is whether you think these kind of new changes and occurrences within the Salafi community is unique to the German context, or whether it's kind of part of a larger occurrence within the global Salafi movement, or even just within Europe.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. I mean, obviously, most of my research was on Germany, but I actually have worked quite closely with one kind of youth Salafi Dawa group, you know, from Birmingham and so on. And there I could already see some kind of differences. I mean, it's here, it's really like, if you look at the kind of like how the legal framework in Germany and the legal framework in the UK works, it's quite different. Like here in the UK, it's essentially much easier to be recognized as an official Islamic community. You have to, you know, go to the Charity Law or the Charity Act and so on. While in Germany, you kind of have to get something which is called the Körperschaft des öffentlichen Rechts, which is essentially something like you have to become an official state partner and legal entity, and you have to prove much more things than, for instance, in the UK, in order to become a recognized Islamic community, which is our topic today. And for instance, even like big mosque associations such as DITIB in Germany, which runs more than 900 mosques, they are not officially recognized, you know. But Salafis in Germany are engaging with this kind of framework, which is in front of their doors. And I think similar to the UK, they're engaging with their kind of, you know, a framework which is in front of their doors, the Charity Law, much more kind of grassroots activities, which is different to the German context. But I think that is the thing which can be kind of almost generalized a little bit. I mean, we are always thinking that the Salafi movements are always kind of inspired, funded, and influenced by especially Saudi Arabia and to some extent other countries and other religious authorities. But if we actually really follow our empirical data, we see actually wherever we Salafism, whether it's in Cambodia, whether it's in Germany, whether it's in the UK, Salafi actors are to some extent one of the most kind of accommodating and most adaptive actors, also because they actually don't have so much kind of transnational funding, which you, for instance, see with like, you know, Turkish Islam in Germany, for instance. So they have to adapt. They're in Europe, they are quite weak institutional movement. Again, they have to adapt. And I think that is interesting to compare how you find this very different kinds of regional manifestations of the Salafi movement, which to some or the other extent still sticks close to its doctrinal core and manhaj and so on. Certainly there are these kind of similarities, but there are also across all these regions, even in Germany, regionally, you find different kinds of influences, which doesn't go against this kind of foreign kind of manipulated kind of movement, and which I think for us, and which is also why is it so appealing to British youth, German youth, Dutch youth, because it speaks to the local context, what these youngsters, but also not only youngsters, generally kind of post-migrant kind of identities seek, or what they're longing for in that regard, which I find quite interesting, and which you also do, Iman, with your kind of more like common sense kind of practice of Salafi actors, like kind of different forms of agency. So yeah, that is something which I find interesting. Yeah.
Thank you so much. That was really, really fascinating. I loved hearing about your fieldwork reflections, as well as your amazing insights into Salafism in Germany. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today for our podcast series, Rethinking Contemporary Islamic Movements in and Across Europe and the Middle East. We've really enjoyed it, and yeah, looking forward to continuing our discussions in the coming months.
Thanks,
Thank
Arndt.
you so much for having me.